Signore e signori, buonasera. Buonasera. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò. We are delighted to have back on our stage two beloved persons that have been here several times. The host of the evening, Grazia D'Annunzio, and her guest, Valerie Steele. This morning when I was getting ready and getting dressed, I was really questioning what I should wear with these two ladies on the stage. And then while I was preparing for the evening, I read this interview that Valerie gave in which she says, academics, quite apart from being what I've called the worst dressed middle-class occupational group in America. And I thought to myself, I think I can beat that. So here we are. So we are delighted because we have this occasion to talk about fashion, with one of the pioneers in the history of fashion as a discipline, Dr. Valerie Steele, who graduated in history from Yale University. She's author of more than 25 books. She's the director of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where she curated dozens of exhibits. The current exhibit that is going to be at the center of the conversation between Dr. Steele and Grazia is about Paris, capital of fashion. And of course, being at Casa Italiana, we added the 3 Italian capitals of fashion, and I think one of the points of contention is going to be, is there one capital of fashion? Are there more capital of fashions? Where are they? And I'm knowing Dr. Steele and Dr. D'Annunzio, I think it's going to be a very lively, spirited conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it. And so, first of all, I want to suggest that those of you who have not seen the exhibit, go see it. This is a chance to remind you to go see the exhibit at the Fashion Institute of Technology Museum. And I would like also to introduce Grazia. Grazia D'Annunzio, as you know, is a frequent host for our fashion, style, design, architecture events here at Casa Italiana. She was for almost 40 years with Vogue Italia, and she's right now teaching fashion journalism at the State University in Milan. With Grazia, we are also working on preparing a special series that she will give as a sort of introduction to the world of fashion here at Casa Italiana next spring. We have a tentative title, it's not defined yet, but stay tuned if you're interested, so you will be able to participate in this series of encounters that Grazia will lead. And now, without further ado, please welcome Grazia D'Annunzio and Valerie Steele.
Here. Okay. Hello, I'm gonna start a new trend since I sat on my eyeglasses and I broke them. This is the new trend, and if I don't wear them, I can't even read. So, welcome everybody to Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò. New friends, old friends, future friends, and thank you, Valerie, for being here tonight. The last exhibition that you curated, like Stefano already told us, is called Paris, Capital of Fashion, and is still on view at the Museum of F.I.T. So why did you choose this title, and what makes a city becoming a fashion capital?
Well, so you know, I've been working on Paris for years, since French has been basically the only language apart from Indonesian that I've managed to function in. And we had done a show a few years ago called Global Fashion Capitals, about the proliferation of fashion capitals, so that in addition to the big 4, the oligarchy, Paris, Milan, London, and New York, now there are fashion shows all over the world, not just Tokyo and Shanghai, but Moscow, St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, I mean, everywhere in the world. And so I got to thinking, well, if fashion's produced everywhere around the world and shown everywhere, what makes a fashion capital? And it has to be one that is a city that's really leading in a certain kind of fashion. And historically, it's tended to be an economic, political, and a cultural center. Now, it was easy for Paris to be all of them because that had been the capital of a united nation state for centuries. Italy is trickier because Italy wasn't a nation state until
No.
the 19th century. So you couldn't have one city continuously being it. And as we'll see, I mean, Rome has a claim, certainly was a fashion capital for a while. Florence and Milan ultimately triumphed. But for quite a while, the three of them were duking it out, trying to figure out who would
And
be
they
the
battles
capital.
all together, yeah,
Yeah.
one against the other, yeah.
And so it was, fashion capitals are places where people come to learn about fashion, to acquire fashion. Fashion doesn't necessarily have to be produced there, although historically it was. In fact, historically it helped if there was a river nearby so you could ship the fashion out easily and cheaply.
So when did fashion start in Paris?
Oh, it was already there in the Middle Ages. And interestingly enough, a new book points out that in part because of Italian artisans who were lured up to Paris because they had special skills that the French government wanted to attract for their guilds, whether it was as shoemakers, as lace makers, as embroiderers. And so all of these guilds became very important. And already by the late 17th century, Paris had followed Spain to become sort of the leading capital in the West in fashion. And Colbert, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's Minister of Finance, famously, perhaps apocryphally, said, "Fashion will be for France what the gold mines in Peru are for Spain." In other words, the financial capital.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes, also we have people upstairs. Okay. It's interesting to notice that in the first part of the 20th century, the majority of couture houses were held by women.
Yes.
Augusta Bernard,
Oh, they're all over. I mean, you think
Chanel,
Chanel's the big one, but
Schiaparelli,
V&A,
Madame Grey. So, and then after the war, the situation drastically changed, and the new look was invented by this Monsieur Dior, who revolutionized the fashion in France. So how, I mean, you know, in which way Dior was a revolutionary and why his new look became so iconic?
Well, I think that what you see with Dior is similar to what you saw a century earlier with Charles Frederick Worth. Because before Worth came in the middle of the 19th century, couturiers, female almost exclusively, were artisans. They were seamstresses, because couture just means sewing. And so working class women, maybe they had one or two apprentices. "Madam, may I sew your dress?" They'd be down kneeling in front of you, hemming your dress. And Worth came in, and instead of that, he would say, "Here's my collection. Choose which of my genius products you want to buy, and we'll fit it to you." But that's not what he did. I mean, every dress was fitted to you then. What he did was to announce himself as a businessman and an artist. So he transformed fashion from a small-scale craft into big business and high art. Well, Dior did something not dissimilar, because although people like Chanel and Schiaparelli had big fashion companies, many of the couturiers in 1930s France had quite small ones, and you didn't need very many clients to start your own company. V&A started in 1914 with about 3 clients. And Lanvin worked her way up from being a milliner to making children's clothes to finally becoming a couturier. So you didn't need that much money to start. But after World War II, you needed more money, and Dior launched the new look on the basis of the Boussac textile fortune. So that, I think, was an important point. Also, similar to Worth, men after World War II increasingly claimed that fashion was, as Jacques Fass said, fashion is an art and men are the artists. The only role a woman should have in fashion is wearing clothes. And when he said that in an interview in, I think, 1953, people said, what about Chanel and V&A? But back then, in the 1920s and 1930s, Chanel was saying, fashion is not an art. Fashion is a craft, a business, a part of everyday life. And back then, in the 1920s and 1930s, was the era of the new woman, and most people thought, who better to dress a new woman than another new woman? In fact, poor Jean Patou had to tell the press, you don't have to be a woman
Yes.
to make women's clothes. You know, men can do it too. But attitudes had changed by the 50s, the era of the feminine mystique. People increasingly thought that women should do womanly things and men should do male things. And increasingly at the highest level of fashion, that meant that gay men should make high fashion art fashion for women, their female clients. And, you know, if you couldn't afford that, you went to a little dressmaker around the corner who was a woman. Like a great chef was a man and, you know, home cooking was mom.
So this is the famous bar jacket that is very iconic. And let's see, this is another interesting shape that Dior did in 1951. And,
well, all of them, I mean, the image that Dior brought forth was a very old-fashioned image. It's so interesting because it was called the New Look. Carmel Snow said, my, what a new look you have, Christian. But in fact, it harkened back to the Belle Epoque, and in other ways, it harkened back to 1938 and 39, right before the war came. And so very much a historicizing look, a romantic look, that had been put on ice during the war years, especially in America and Great Britain because of, you know, restrictions in what you could use, the amount of fabric, etc. In France, for most people, it was poverty and the occupation. You took your husband's old suits and you cut them up and curtains to make yourself clothes. But on the couture level, working for actresses or aristocrats or, you know, the buffs, the beurre au fromage millionaires, you could use elaborate amounts of material. So Dior went and did that, and it was a transformative for women around the world. As Dior said, women had looked during the war like boxers. He said, I wanted them to look like flowers.
the famous flower look that Dior,
hyper feminine look.
Yeah. Okay, look what I found. Maruccelli and Dior.
Ah, yes. Okay.
You know that, right?
Tell the story, 'cause it's
no,
a
no,
good
you told the story.
No, you tell it.
Okay. Germana Maruccelli, this is, I'm very proud of that because Germana Maruccelli is a fashion designer totally underestimated. And she was a genius, total genius. First of all, she was one of the first who really tried to do fashion free from foreign diktats, free from the Parisian style and vogue. And she is one of the first couturier who went to show her creations in Florence in 1951. But look at this. She did, in 1949, this wonderful, it's called shell-pleated dress. It's the one that you have on the left.
Yeah.
And Dior did the same 3 seasons after. And Maruccelli was absolutely underestimated, but we know, Dior scholars know that sometimes Monsieur Dior also, let's say, took inspiration from an almost unknown Italian fashion designer, Germana Maruccelli. Germana Maruccelli is also famous because in 1949, founded a prize, Sambabila Prize. And it was a festival devoted totally to poetry. And the first poet that was awarded by Maruccelli Foundation was Giuseppe Ungaretti, was one of the most famous poet that we have in Italy. And Maruccelli was also perceived like the intellectual couturier in Italy.
But the interesting thing is when you're talented, often your fame is not related to the amount of talent or originality, but the venue in which you perform. And so someone like Schiaparelli would never have become world famous had she stayed in Rome. Or stayed in New York, where she went later on. It was only by establishing herself as a couturier on the world stage in Paris that she could become world famous. And so this, because Paris had this for 3 centuries, it provided what lawyers call an incredible precedent to maintain this position. But of course, by this time, after the war, Paris was increasingly challenged. It was weakened by the Nazi occupation, challenged by Italian cities, as a lot of Americans, when they started going to Florence or Rome, fell in love with all these charming, principessas who invited them to their palazzi and were really nice to them instead of being snobbish and hostile like the French. And then they would say, and the clothes were, well, maybe it wasn't like, if you compare it to wine, it might not be Chateau Margaux, but it was pretty damn nice, and it cost a hell of a lot less than the French couture. So studies of the rise of the Italian fashion world pay attention to the incredible importance of American clients, just as the American clients had kind of made French couture. And Worth said he loved the Americans. He said they had the faces, the figures, and the francs.
Yes.
And after the war, they also showed that with Italy.
Yeah, absolutely true. And this is the Pitti Sala Bianca is one of the most incredible places that we have in Italy that hosted was the birthplace of Italian fashion in 1952. And,
such a beautiful, glamorous setting for this first show.
Yeah, that was great.
And although the first show only had a handful of American journalists and buyers, the reports that they gave back home were so laudatory that the next season it was mobbed.
Yeah, and the first show was not here. Was in 1951 at this gentleman, Giovan Battista Giorgini's private residence, Villa Torreggiani. And he invited a nice group of, he was a businessman, a Tuscan businessman. He invited a nice group of buyers, international buyers, especially American buyers, a small group of journalists, and he did a 3-day marathon, starting with a big news. He started the fashion marathon with a new sector called boutique, and then accessories, and then eventually the couture gown, and it finished with a lavish ball. And Giorgini was very astute. He was a well-trained communicator, and he decided to have soirees, suppers, and also organized a city tour for the buyers. And he launched Florence as the cradle of the Italian fashion. Also, not only because he was from Florence, and not only because Florence had a long time reputation for fashion, because if you think of Gucci and Ferragamo were labels very famous from the 20s, but also because he wanted to create a fashion that was free from foreign diktat. And
we've lost the...
Okay, we lost.
Maybe I pushed the cable out.
Maybe we...
I was trying to look at it, and I've...
No. Okay. No.
No.
Okay.
Thank you. We need...
Okay, great.
Brilliant.
Okay. So he also decided to have Florence as a cradle of Italian fashion, because in this effort of presenting fashion, Italian fashion, free from Paris diktat, what was a better place than Florence? Florence was the center of culture, especially in the Renaissance, and he wanted also the creators, or the people that he invited, looking back to our glorious past, and especially to Renaissance.
Which is really interesting, because the French did something very similar, which you see if you go to my show, where they constantly harken back to Versailles and the glories of the French monarchy and the court. There's a whole section in my show sort of from the splendor of the royal court to the spectacle of the haute couture. And he's doing the same thing, saying, look at our illustrious artistic heritage, and it continues to this day.
And in fact, this is Pucci. And Pucci was one of the pioneers of the so-called boutique look. And Emilio Pucci, the Marquis Emilio Pucci, was the best translator of Giorgini's idea, being modern and at the same time looking to the glorious past. I mean, he was famous for this psychedelic print, but look.
Yeah.
Val.
Well, it's, of course, it's right in the center of Florence, so
Yes.
it's a landmark for every tourist.
At the beginning of his career, Pucci, in the first part of the 50s, printed on silk and on cotton, some items mutuated from art and Italian art and folklore. So this is a scarf, and this is the replica of the baptistry of Florence, San Giovanni. These are shorts and a little prendisole, a little shirt dress with the prints of the Sicilian cart. This is the psychedelic print inspired by Capri Island, the Blue Grotto. This is what Pucci himself told us, and the Capri prints.
So, I mean, all of the romance of visiting Italy as a tourist was central to the whole post-war rise of Italian fashion. And it didn't hurt at all that so many of the designers, like Pucci, were aristocrats. That really was another sort of lure. Mm-hmm. But if you saw that movie, you know, about Ripley, all of the scenes of Italy were so glamorous, and this was something that the American press couldn't get enough of in the 50s. And the fact that so many new stylish products were coming out of Italy, it wasn't just fashion, it was furniture, it was all kinds of graphic design.
Yes.
You know, typewriters, everything.
Yeah. And another famous designers, very pioneer as well, in the boutique section, and another aristocrat was
Simonetta, right?
Simonetta Visconti di Cesarò. Another one that, you know, you probably never heard of, but she was extremely popular here. At Berg of Goodman, they went crazy for her.
About her. They absolutely loved her, and she traveled all around the United States and talked to people about connections between Italy and the United States. And you have a whole amazing discourse in the American press, not just the fashion press, but the travel press, the leisure press, talking about how Italy is so accessible for Americans. Italy is so romantic, but it's also, it's not stiff, it's not formal. It's like a kind of beautiful vacation land where you can go, and they like the same things that Americans do. They like family, they like food, they like vacation, but they do it all so glamorously. And so something like, you know, shorts or sandals going on vacation to the beach, suddenly you could get hyper glamorous sandals and capri pants and all of this that Americans who thought of themselves as being all about sportswear and casual living suddenly could see themselves swanning around in, you know, a palazzo instead.
Absolutely. And look, talking about Renaissance, this is a modern page, una paggetta, and also the head is mazzocco, is a typical head that you can find in Piero della Francesca and some other Renaissance painters.
And this is one of my favorite pictures because the sleeves and then also the little shorts, it's halfway between haute couture and the kind of American sportswear and play suits that Claire McCardle did.
Yes.
I mean, there it is. It's like a relaxed play suit with sandals, and yet so glamorous. It has such a high fashion quotient in it.
Absolutely.
That's what Americans were crazy about.
And the gladiator sandal actually were very, very popular in the 50s. Yes, and this is another, you know, looking to the past, to our past, and make it modern.
And remember, too, that having sandals that were this naked was still kind of shocking for Americans, because the idea that, you know, women, that feet are kind of sexual and kind of abject, and you kind of cover up your feet most of the time. And so gradually, already in the 30s, you had little bits of sandals that would show off a little more, but it wasn't really quite appropriate. But these sandals are practically naked sandals, and that then becomes appreciated and seen as being part of this sensual, sun-loving, fun-loving culture. And again, it's very stereotyped. It's kind of patronizing in some ways, but you read these American articles, and they're just gushing about how beautiful Italian men and women are. And they go on and on and on about how they epitomize, you know, feminine sensuality and male virility. And it's really a kind of extreme idealization of Italians as people, as sexual people.
And talking about big sleeves, the king of sleeves, this is Cristobal Balenciaga. Yes. So introduce a little bit Balenciaga, who was, you know, one of the greatest talent
But again,
Genius.
like Schiaparelli, had he stayed in Madrid, he would have had no international profile. He would have been famous among, Spanish stylish people, but not
Right, but not-
internationally.
So this is a picture of one of Balenciaga's first show that Irving Penn photographed for Vogue in 1950. And this is Lisa Penn, the wife, Penn's wife.
So beautiful.
And it's interesting to know that Balenciaga was totally maniac for details. And he worked sometimes 6 months on a sleeve. And Dior adored Balenciaga,
absolutely.
right?
No, all of the other fashion designers admired Balenciaga because he was such a perfectionist. I think most of the public, the ordinary public, had a hard time with him. It was easy to see Dior. Dior was like romantic, pretty. Balenciaga was much more austere, much more avant-garde.
Yes,
Especially
very.
when you look at these, they're really avant-garde. When he did his sack dress, the people went, oh, he's destroyed women's figures. There's
Right.
no more body anymore. There was no danger of that, really, with Dior. Although even when Dior, when he did the A-line, people said, oh, he's sort of not enough figure there.
Yeah. And actually, Dior called Balenciaga the master of all of us.
Yes.
And an interesting aspect that I recently found of Balenciaga is his love for movies. And he designed some costumes for movies like this. It's a Spanish movie. You can actually see this is a Balenciaga dress, the same dress. You can find it, yeah. And is a movie that is absolutely unknown. It's a Spanish movie called Alta Costura, Haute Couture, Alta Costura, and it was done in 1947. And
Is that obtainable? Can you watch that?
I think on YouTube you can see something, and it's one of the movies that they are, based on a fashion house like Roberta. Roberta was one of the most famous American one, and Alta Costura is the Spanish version of our the Roberta. This is the ecclesiastic look. That is amazing. Balenciaga was a genius. And look, the same cape in Anastasia.
Well, of course, it reminds you, too, how so much of what we think about fashion and appreciate and learn about fashion comes to us not from fashion magazines, but from films. And this was much more true in the past, even, than
Yes.
it is today, much more. But there, too, if you had a film industry, like Hollywood or Hollywood on the
Right.
Tiber in Rome, that really helped promote the fashions you were creating.
Absolutely.
Obviously, you find some of that in France, too. You find Yves Saint Laurent dressing beautiful woman. What's her name?
Catherine Deneuve.
Catherine Deneuve, right. But when there's a real business and you're churning out a lot of films that have a world reach, then that really helps promote a country's fashion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is another dress that he designed for North by Northwest. And Ava Gardner also wore, in a very undescripted movies, Angels wore red. And she wore a Balenciaga dress. And this is the poster of the exhibition that was done in Ghettaria, who is the birthplace, Balenciaga birthplace, last year. Another great designer that started as an apprentice of Balenciaga is Givenchy.
Yeah.
So what do you like about Givenchy?
Well, Givenchy is really kind of the prototypical French designer of the 1950s and early 60s. His look was pretty, it was feminine, it was young. I think that it was less avant-garde in some respects than Saint Laurent would be. And yet, because he'd been such a close friend and student of of Balenciaga, his clothes were also directional. Not as aggressively avant-garde as Balenciaga, but directional enough so that they were very important for the world of fashion. Much copied. And of course, because of his connection with Audrey Hepburn, that made him internationally famous in another way. He wore him on screen and off screen, sometimes on screen because of Byzantine Hollywood rules, he didn't get credit for
Yeah.
the dresses.
Yeah, because, Edith Head, she was the chief designer at Paramount, didn't want to have Givenchy credited until in the 60s, she decided to have, Givenchy's name for Breakfast at Tiffany. We will see something. When she got the Academy Award for Roman Holidays in 1953, she was dressed in Givenchy. And Givenchy actually thought when she went to visit him in Paris, and they announced Mrs. Hepburn, he thought that Katharine Hepburn was there.
Well,
because he never heard of, Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn was very young.
Well, Coco Chanel had the opposite problem when they wanted to make a play about Coco Chanel on Broadway, and they said, well, Hepburn will play you. She said, oh boy, because she thought it was Audrey Hepburn. She was really bummed out that it was Katharine Hepburn.
And so here's some wonderful outfit that he created for Sabrina.
Yeah.
And of course, when Audrey Hepburn went to ask Givenchy to give her some dresses, she said, well, I'm extremely busy in doing my collection. I have something ready for you if you want to bring it to Hollywood. And she actually picked that dress and that tire. And this is the...
Here she's from her beatnik scene.
Yeah.
So fabulous.
This is wonderful.
Funny face, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Funny face.
That was one of the quintessential fashion movies. And Givenchy is interesting in another way. He's that rare individual, an aristocrat who became an artist. Mm-hmm. That's practically unprecedented. Almost all artists are middle class or working class. You think, well, Toulouse-Lautrec, not too many others.
Mm-hmm.
But from
so
an
true.
early age,
Yeah.
he knew he wanted to go into fashion.
And then the most iconic look. This is Breakfast at Tiffany. It's a very dark picture, but we can see a better close-up.
Beautiful little black dress. I think still for most people that epitomizes the charm and allure of the little black dress.
And look at the toga dress. That, of course, if you wrap around yourself a sheet, you're not going to look like that. As we all know. Yeah, right. Look at the so exquisite. Yeah. Okay.
Well, and again, with images, fashion images from Paris are legion. And it is important to sort of have, here's the model at Versailles, here's the model by the Eiffel Tower, by the metro station when you came in. But Rome is also filled with iconic settings, which help promote Roman fashion through international fashion magazines. So, everybody goes to Rome and sees this kind of thing.
Right. And this is the Sorelle Fontana dress. And it's interesting to realize that Sorelle Fontana became very famous for dressing Lydia Christian when she got married to Tyrone Power. They dressed also President Truman's daughter when she was married to I don't remember who, and also dressed Audrey Hepburn for a wedding that never happened. When she was filming Roman Holidays in Rome, she was engaged with a noble British guy. And she went to the Fontana sister.
As so many did for their wedding dresses.
Yes, because they became very famous, especially after Lydia Christian. Yeah. And at the end, the engagement, went off, and someone else wore the dress. And it's interesting to see that in the couture section of Italy, while boutique was very modern and very avant-garde in a way, and very modern, the couture was always pay a tribute to French fashion.
Yeah.
In fact, the Fontana,
in silhouette and in concept, you can make some distinctions. If you're looking at comparing Italian alta moda from Rome with French haute couture, often the Italian dresses are more brilliantly colored. There may be although both lavishly use embroideries, etc., I think probably experts could tell the difference between the embroidery that's being done in Rome and in Paris. But the color, I think, is one of the most striking
Yes.
features. There's a fearlessness about the color.
And also a cut that it was much more comfortable.
Yes. Well, that, of course, French fashion from the 17th century on was very, very structured. Although, as my friend reminded me this afternoon, she said, you must tell them that the French got everything from Italy, you know, with Maria de Medici going up there and marrying the French.
Right. And the Sorelle Fontana also became well known because they established a very good relationship with Ava Gardner, and they dressed her on and off stage. This is a dress that they did for the opening of Barefoot Contessa.
Yes.
And this is the dress that one of the dresses that they designed for Barefoot Contessa. And check the embroidery and the nice pink silk.
So beautiful.
And the Fontana also designed the entire movie, I mean, all the costumes for Le Amiche, Antonioni's Le Amiche. And this is interesting because Antonioni was always very linked to fashion. And Antonioni's first movie was a documentary on rayon, Quattro cani e un vestito. So
On rayon? Mm-hmm. How extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. And if you study Antonioni, you can also study also the history of fashion. Fashion played always a very important role in Antonioni's movie. And Le Amiche is an interesting movie because it takes place in a fashion house in Turin. But it's not.
Another great fashion city.
Exactly, another great fashion city. But it's not a comedy. It's not a comedy, it's a drama. So it's also a departure of the genre of the movies based in a fashion house. And then they design the costumes and also for the famous défilé, because in every fashion movie you have a fashion défilé. And this is the one of the outfit with the... And this is Gattinoni, another couturier that became famous during the 50s in Rome and was also very active in Hollywood. Also, we have to, maybe you want to introduce the Hollywood on Tiber.
Well, I mean,
how all of a sudden Rome became important.
It's sometimes you forget about it now, but if you think of those movies like Cleopatra, a lot of those big American films from the 50s were filmed in Rome. Mm-hmm. And you had the Cinecittà,
Cinecittà.
Like studios, yes, where you could go, and not only did Italian directors make their films there, but a lot of American directors did too. So there was a constant influx of American movie stars who were shopping there at the
because
houses.
Thanks to the Marshall plans, a lot of people came to Rome in order to make a kind of rebirth, and the Cinecittà studios were cheaper than the Hollywood studios. So this is why Quo Vadis, Three Coins in the Fountain, Roman Holidays
and also
were filmed in Rome in that period.
And although probably the directors and producers didn't care so much, but the costumes were so much better. If you go to see some of the remaining film costumes from this period in collections in Italy, they are astonishingly beautifully made. Really, absolutely like couture masterpieces. When you have some of that in Hollywood, because you also had very skilled seamstresses working for the Hollywood studios, but it's not typical, of course, of most filmmaking.
Yeah. And so the stars came to Rome for filming. They came to Rome for holidays. Their pictures became, their pictures in Rome doing shopping on filming became internationally known and printed all over, the world in, all the international magazines. And Rome became a destination. And one of the other, apart from the Fontana, another famous couturier who became extremely well known in the 50s was Fernanda Gattinoni, who worked in London and in Paris at Molyneux.
Oh, okay.
And you can see French influence here in the nightgowns, very Madame Grey. And she also was very tailored. I mean, she was famous for her impeccable English cut for the day wear. And she worked for Anna Magnani. Anna Magnani was crazy for her little black dresses. Lana Turner, Audrey Hepburn again in War and Peace. And the Empire line also informed an entire collection of Gattinoni. And of course, Ingrid Bergman. Ingrid Bergman was a very good friend of Gattinoni, and Gattinoni dressed her off stage and on stage. Even Cactus Flower, that was done in this country, she had, she was all dressed in Gattinoni, and this is Europa 51, Rossellini. So this Hollywood on Tiber season, you have gazillions of stars choosing a particular atelier. For instance, Lauren Bacall loved Simonetta.
Well, Simonetta was fabulous anyway. Simonetta did, really young and modern things, using interesting materials. Yes. She was really clever.
Yes. And Sophia and Gina loved all the exuberance of Emilio Schubert.
Yes, another great, but more of a grand couturier. Mm-hmm. Simonetta and her husband Fabiani went briefly to Paris. Yes. They tried to make the move from Rome to Paris. Yes. It didn't really work out, and so that damaged them. Yeah,
and they actually went to Paris in 1961, and it was a big flop. Yeah. And the Parisians didn't like them. No, of course. That was a huge flop. They went there, and they showed there for 3 or 4 years in Rue François Première, and they went there with Capucci. Roberto Capucci. Roberto Capucci is another underestimated couturier, extremely talented. It was nicknamed the Givenchy of Rome, but actually for me was more like a Balenciaga.
Or like a Charles James.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's very much these abstract shapes.
And he did for Esther Williams, which is photographed there, this dress, which is called Nove Gonne, 9 gowns.
I remember I interviewed Capucci in Rome, and I asked him, I wanted to borrow one of his dresses for my exhibition, Fashion Italian Style, which I did years ago. And I said, well, which one do you recommend? And he said, oh, my dresses are like my children. How can you ask me to choose just one that I love? But he was very generous. He definitely lent.
Yeah. And then which one did he give you?
A very pretty one. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's in the book.
These are other examples of Capucci, impeccable and, sculptural style. And here we go. And then you have
Yves Saint Laurent, of course. So, when Dior really ruled from 47 to 57, but his number one assistant was Yves Saint Laurent. And, of course, the Dovima and the Elephant's dress, which is, it's Soirée de Paris is the name of the dress. That was actually designed by Yves Saint Laurent. And we have that on display now in Paris, capital of fashion. Our example was worn by Marlene Dietrich. So it has, I think you can tell, this sort of real bravura quality. There are a number of interesting ones. We compare this one in the exhibition with another quieter one that he named Mystère de New York. But the French Vogue, as well as the American fashion magazines, like to show the clothes in Paris and in New York as well, to try and pick up the idea that you would be getting clients all over.
And that was the first collection that he did for Dior, right?
I think,
or not?
No, I think Dior was still alive.
Was still alive. And then, for a brief period, he became the chief.
Very brief, yes, before he was fired and they brought in Marc Bohan.
Yeah.
And had a nervous breakdown.
Yeah, and then he went solo, Saint Laurent. So these are another couple of wonderful looks.
And although, it's interesting because in many ways in the 60s, the London and New York were really ahead of things because they had a much more of a youth culture. France and Italy didn't really have a youth culture in the same way, possibly because there actually was a slowdown in terms of the birth rate after the war. So you didn't have the same little the girls dressing as boys and the boys with long hair and the Beatles, etc. I mean, you have people like Johnny Hallyday, but only for the French would this be a rock star. And so what the French had to do was to come up with a kind of metaphor for youth, because they didn't have their own real youthquake. And the metaphor they came up with was really kind of a space age to look something that will be modern. So, of course, with the Mondrian collection, Yves Saint Laurent looked at Mondrian's paintings and did very flat little mini dresses. He also took a page both out of young English designers, but also his love for Marlene Dietrich, and did pantsuits for women quite early for the French. Courrèges was also very early in doing that, therefore by making it more acceptable for ladies who lunch, who were not about to wear the kind of pantsuits and mini dresses that the youthquake designers were promoting.
Right. And this is another.
And then brilliantly, of course, he established Rive Gauche, his ready-to-wear line, and went out really saying that couture, he said, I'm not going to close down the couture, all of my workers depend on me, but really I want to dress young women who are not going to be standing around for multiple fittings. And at one point he even held up two dresses, one from the couture and one from Rive Gauche, that looked identical, and said, both of these are mine. He was really expanding into a young market. And the Rive Gauche, not only as a business model, but also as designs, were tremendously avant-garde, really important. Valentino.
Valentino, actually, in the late 50s, when Saint Laurent became very famous at Dior, Valentino came back from Paris, where he used to work at Guy Laroche and Jean Dessay, and established himself in Rome. And he became famous because he was probably, I think, do you agree? It was probably the first international couturier that we had, with a nice group of international clients.
He had a really important group of clients. I mean, people like Jackie Kennedy were wearing his things. It was more profound. It was more high society, not just movie stars. And so I think it got all the glamour, but also all of the respect and sort of importance of French couture. So, I mean, when he did these little white dresses that were just so incredibly beautiful and made him a star instantly.
Yeah. He did a remarkable first show in 1962 in Pitti, at Pitti in Florence, and then in 1967 he did an entire white collection, which is this one, and Jackie Kennedy picked up the dress for her wedding to Onassis from that collection, and you have it on the right. And also, it was famous. Valentino was famous also for the animal prints.
Yes.
And again, another wonderful couple of Audrey Hepburn pictures wearing Valentino with the flower cape and the Mirella Peteni, yes,
Valentino
yes,
red.
And the famous red, Valentino red.
And when I did Fashion Italian Style, it was great. I called up Carlos Souza and I said, well, I want to include Valentino in the show, and you know, something, we don't have a red dress. And he said, well, let's bring you lots of red dresses, you know. So it was really fun working with them and getting the clothes into the exhibition, into the museum.
Okay, now, in your book, which is not the catalog of Paris fashion, capital of fashion. There's another book that Valerie wrote on French fashion, and it's called Paris Fashion, A Culture and History. You wrote, I quote, lacking a genuine youth culture, French fashion designers in the 60s tended to use futurism and the metaphor of youth.
Yes.
So let's
Well, I mean,
explore a little bit the...
Courrèges did this the most and the best, although Cardin did it as well. So you had white, you had plastic, you had trousers as well. You had a kind of vision of what would people wear in the future, what would people wear in outer space, that was a kind of a metaphor for youth and the future. And that was an important stage. These are very common in museums for a sort of obvious reason, people only wore them for a short period of time. They were very popular. They were copied, and I remember when I was a child, they were making little Koresh boots for children, copies, you know, like rip-offs. And so we had those in grade school, but it only lasted a short period. So then they went into
Paco
museums.
Rabanne, yeah.
Paco Rabanne, even more so. Now, if you've never seen the movie Qui êtes-vous, Polly Magoo,
Oh.
you have to see it, because there's a great spoof of a Rabanne-like
Yes.
designer who's doing all these clothes made out of metal. And people are kind of staring, and a girl gets cut on her metal dress, and he's just like, oh, slap some makeup over it.
Yeah.
And everyone's sort of watching, and they don't know what to say, and then the Diana Vreeland character stands up and starts applauding, and then
Yeah.
everyone, yes, thank you, everybody starts applauding. But Paco Rabanne was taking the idea of body adornment, jewelry, new materials like plastic and metal, and transforming them into fashion.
And this is from the recent exhibition
Yes,
at
the
the Brooklyn
Cardin
Museum,
show.
the Cardin show.
And Cardin, of course, also did it for men and for women. And so it is visions of the future. That's what that look was about.
Now, it's interesting to notice that fashion and art was a favorite combination for Italian designers. I'm thinking, you know, of, first of all, Fortuny.
Yeah.
And the pleated dress that was an homage to the ancient Greek. Genoni, Rosa Genoni, with the Renaissance, you know, the cape that, you know, were inspired by the cape of Pisanello and
all
other
the futurist artists.
and the futurist
inspired
artists,
everybody.
exactly. Then I'm thinking of Schiaparelli.
Yeah.
But then in the 60s, in Milan, and this is another city that we're going to add to our conversation, we had two designers that they were really linked with art, to art. And one is, again, Maruccelli, that we met before. And I love these two dresses because one is also speaks about her collaboration with Paolo Scheggi, the painter, on the left. And the other one is her collaboration with another artist, contemporary artist, Italian contemporary artist, Getulio Alviani, who did the helmet and the aluminum disc that they are, you know, on that long dress.
That brief period in the 60s and even up to the early 70s, before things turned ugly politically, there was a lot of really interesting art fashion overlap in Italy.
Yes, and look at Mila Schön
Yes.
with Calder, a collaboration with Alexander Calder and Fontana, Lucio Fontana with the famous lashes.
Well, I think it's not accidental that then the first modern show about fashion and art took place in Florence
Absolutely true. Yes, yes.
in the whatever 90s.
90, yeah, and Franca Sozzani curated it, my mentor and former boss. Another interesting things that I really would like to ask you is how come a French fashion designer all of a sudden, starting in the 60s and especially in the 70s, came to Italy to work for Italian industries, and this is Jean-Charles de Castelbajac for Max Mara, and this is Karl Lagerfeld for Max Mara.
Well, what you started to find was a new kind of designer, the stylist, who was not working all the time for one French high fashion house or one French pret-a-porter house, but who was a free agent, was going around. And Karl Lagerfeld kind of epitomizes that, because in addition to his big role at Chanel, he was also kind of freelancing at many places, including Chloe and Max Mara and Fendi, etc. And
also Grazia, even Grazia.
yeah. And so these were companies where there was a big financial textile backing in Italy. What moved Milan ahead, I think, of Rome and Florence
Yes.
was the fact that it wasn't just stuck on the old idea of couture, and it wasn't just on boutique things, which were great, but it moved into an idea of industrial luxury fashion.
Yes.
So it was backed by big textile houses. You had factories that were producing it in large amounts, but it was luxurious. And you could hire, usually anonymously, all kinds of interesting designers, French
Yes.
and Italian.
That's true.
A whole new world. And again, the Americans loved it because they saw it as being luxurious but accessible, clothes that real people, albeit rich real people, could wear.
Yeah, and that was the beginning of the Italian pret-a-porter. And all the designers, like Lagerfeld, who worked for Grazia and Fendi and Max Mara, and Jean-Baptiste Caumont, and Jean-Charles de Castelbaljac, Anne-Marie Beretta, also for Max Mara, they were called stilisti in Italian by this very fashion journalist, Anna Piaggi. And probably the most famous number one stilista was this guy, Walter Albini.
Tragically unknown in the U.S.
Absolutely.
And yet a brilliant designer and a pivotal figure in terms of his impact on fashion in Milan and making it a modern place.
Yes, and here we have Stefano Tonchi, that he's a fashion scholar also, and he wrote an interesting book on Walter Albini recently. So bravo, Stefano. So Walter Albini worked for Grazia, Mr. Fox, Billy Ballo. This is a sketch that he did for Billy Ballo. He worked for different labels, and he really combined a little bit of a fascination for the 30s and 40s with the tribal Moroccan kind of look.
In a way, it reminds me a little bit of what Lagerfeld did with Chloe in the early years. It was very cool. There was kind of deco feel to it, but it was also very global in feeling. It was really beautiful. I had such a hard time getting Albini for the Fashion Italian Style show. Finally, I was able to get something from the Mr. Fox collection in Milan.
Yeah. And also, Albini was very ahead of his time. For instance, he first decided to move from Florence to Milan in 1971. So he was the head of the group of designers, the Missonis, Grazia, and himself. They moved to Milan to show, and he is considered the progenitor of the pret-a-porter. And also his shows, for instance, he did a wonderful show in Florence, in Venice at the Florian in 1974. They were kind of happenings, were very modern. The concept was very, very modern. It was not the regular catwalk. No, they were happenings. And look at this picture. Isn't it wonderful?
I can hardly see.
Okay, this is a picture in Milan of the Italian, the first group of Italian stilisti, the Italian designers: Gianni Versace, Biagiotti, Soprani, Valentino, Anna Fendi, Ferré, Armani, Missoni, Moschino, e Soprani, and the Emilia Schön, and the lady Grazia, and the lady up front is Mulasano. Is exactly one of the most famous Italian journalists in the 70s and in the 80s, and she ended up working for Giorgio Armani. So it's interesting that Walter Albini started a new season in Milan, and after him, other great names follow, right? Like Armani.
Famously Armani. And there, of course, you know the wonderful event. This is from
American Gigolo.
Right, which was great because it showed him either essentially naked or dressed in Armani. And there was wonderful product placement in the film. You have to watch it again. There's scene after scene where all he does is take things out of the closet and lay them on the bed. I mean, it's like he'll spend 10 minutes doing that. So fabulous product placement. And after that film, people in Hollywood, people would say, well, what are you wearing? And they go, Armani. It's Armani. That became the thing, that it was cool. It was not just being like a suit, proving that you were rich and had a job, but it was sexy also, that you were, like a gigolo. People were paying you they'd buy you the suit and then they'd pay you to take it off.
Exactly. And Armani, as you all know, starting as a window dresser at La Rinascente, which is our famous department store in Italy. And then he went to work for a label. Now I have a men's label that I don't even remember. It's not Correggiani, but it's another one. Cerruti, thank you. Jane, thank you. Thank you very much. Cerruti. And then he went solo and he designed for men's first and then for women. And the power suit was extremely influential.
Yes, I mean, if you could say in a way that one of the things Armani did was that let's keep it there for one second. That he eroticized the man's suit, making it softer, less unstructured, less structured. He took it away from the very stereotypical masculine colors like navy blue and charcoal and brought in more ambiguous colors like grayish and taupe. And then with women's suits, he made sort of a more powerful woman. But I love this particular cover and article in Time magazine because, what was his name? Cox. He wrote the article, and he just was so wicked. He went to speak to Pierre Berger. He knew he could get a rise out of him, and he said, what do you think about Italian fashion? And Berger, who was the partner of Yves Saint Laurent, said, what have the Italians ever invented except for pasta? And he goes, Berger, goes, oh, Berger, but what about easy elegance and the unstructured suit and Armani? So he lays him open for making the remark. He knows that he'll make it. And in fact, this idea of menswear being somehow now sensual and even in a sense androgynous, virile but also sensual.
And this is the famous, powerful power dress for women. And apart from Armani,
his antithesis.
Yes.
Versace. And each of them thought the other was terrible.
Yes.
Was either desperately boring or unspeakably vulgar. And so they had their fans. We talk about style tribes when we mean, kids who are punks or goths or emo. But in fact, you have style tribes just as much for grown-up fashion. The Versace tribe would never be caught dead in Armani and vice versa.
Absolutely. And the third member of the so-called Troika, Armani, Versace, is Ferré.
Yes, who studied architecture and who really was a kind of architectural designer. I remember when he went to Paris and was the designer at Dior. And actually, I saw him when he got the Dior, the golden thimble. But I think he must have had a very hard time in France. The French really have a difficulty dealing with foreign designers. They've gotten used to it now, but I think back then it was still a problem having an Italian and a French house.
And plus, when Ferré took over Dior in 1989, and Dior was just bought by Arnault, and he stayed there for 7 years. He used to, travel back and forth. Ferré was a dear friend of mine, and he told me that he was extremely tired all the time, and also I think that his approach was very radical. Instead of paying homage to the history of Dior, he paid homage to himself. So my approach to Dior is very Milanese and very Ferré. I didn't have an approach to Dior as a French label, but I tried to translate also my Milanese background and my Ferré style into Dior. Then we will see later some pictures. It's also interesting to see that in the 80s, a lot of the relationship with art, with fashion and design was very, very strong.
I mean, Milan, I think, to this day is known for furniture and design in general as well as fashion. And if you think about it, the study of fashion design, despite the name, seems to be really separate from design and the history of design. Yet in Milan, that modernity and the approach, you'll find color in the furniture as well as a kind of architectural purity in some of the clothes. So there's some crossover between the two.
And this is, for instance, is typical Ettore Sozza's Memphis living room, and the same colors you can see in a Moschino dress, the same color palette. And Moschino
was so brilliant, so funny. I mean, you see here his parody of a Chanel jacket and then the real Chanel jacket. He was constantly joking, but often with a real seriousness, like you'd have a jacket that would say expensive jacket.
Yes.
He had my favorite, the advertisements that he had that show this sexy but vampirish woman with fangs, and it said, "Smash the fashion system."
Yes.
I mean, it was serious as well, that this was something that he wasn't entirely comfortable with.
And talking about Chanel, this is a picture of Karl Lagerfeld during the first Chanel show that he curated in 1983. So what Lagerfeld was able to bring into Chanel?
You have to remember that Chanel, after she died in 1971, the house went into a deep, deep decline. So only people like, Madame Pompidou wore Chanel. I mean, it was a very, very boring bourgeois house. And when the Wertheimers hired Karl Lagerfeld, people must have thought, this is odd, he's a clever stylist, but why would you hire him for a couture house? And yet he gave a kind of shock treatment to the house of Chanel, which had become so banal and boring. And he took the little suits and he shortened the skirts, or he lengthened the skirts. He made the little suits out of denim, out of leather. He exploded the size of all of the things like the buttons, the C's. I mean, Gabrielle Chanel must have been rolling over in her grave with rage at how he had destroyed her very carefully put together, tasteful, stylish look. But he made it very modern, and he made it a huge, huge success for decades.
We are almost at the end, but I'm sorry to say that to you right now. I see people standing up over there. We have some empty seats here up front, so if you want to sit down, you can. In the 80s, also Paris saw the rising of its enfant terrible, Jean-Paul Gaultier.
Yes.
One of your favorites.
One of my favorites. I mean, Gaultier was really such a famous figure in the 80s. He did menswear, he did women's wear. He mixed up all of gender references. So he had men in skirts, he had women in the tailored suits with broad jackets. He had women in the sort of cone bras. Mm-hmm. He mixed it up in terms of class as well as in terms of gender. I mean, he would show things that were so, like Moschino in a way, mm-hmm. so tacky that they were fabulous.
Yes.
He was really a brilliant, brilliant designer.
And another great designer that I remember, I remember his very first show was Christian Lacroix.
Yes. And you have to remember that at the beginning of the 20th century, there were 110 couture houses. By the 1980s, it had shrunk to about 6. And in 87, when Lacroix opened his, that was the first new couture house in ages. And so it was a big risk. At first, he was a huge success. I mean, with the poof skirt, and of course, it's wonderful. You see the top done as he showed it in his fashion show, and then how Anna Wintour brilliantly styled it on the cover of American Vogue with blue jeans, which totally did a high-low thing, because Lacroix was so elaborate, so lavish, so the ultimate kind of couture and theatrical designer. Mm-hmm.
And also, he loved the south of France. It was yes. from Arles, so a lot of the patterns and the colors and is very much from that area. And in a way, in a very different way, he reminds me of Dolce & Gabbana, that they are so linked to their roots, right?
Well, yes, and you wonder how that is, how it happens sometimes that a designer will focus on a place and the aura of a place. The idea that Dolce & Gabbana focused on sort of Sicily as this romantic image, in a way it reminds me of what the Italians were doing in the 50s.
Absolutely.
When they promoted sort of touristic Bella
yes.
Italia to an American market.
They reminded me a lot of Pucci, what we saw before. and the love of neorealism. And look at Isabella Rossellini, very young, and yeah. And this is Dior by Ferré. And we have some pictures here, and this is the day d'or that Ferré received after his first collection, the haute couture collection, and some example of his, over-the-top grand style. And opposite that, the 990 minimalism.
Oh, yes. I mean, Prada, everybody wore Prada desperately. She moved from sort of a luggage and accessory company to becoming really the sort of intellectual star of modern fashion, not just Italian fashion, but modern fashion, showing in Paris. And again, you find Valentino would often show in Paris. So you find a new kind of migration where Prada would show in Paris. Miu
Miu
would
Miu.
sometimes show in Paris as well.
Miu Miu is actually always in Paris. Yeah, yes, and the 90s also is an interesting decade because is when the battle of fashion acquisition started, right?
Yes, and
between Italy and France.
and
The
in
battle between Italy and France.
In a way, you're finding, I would say, that's one of the main reasons why, amongst the oligarchy, the big four in fashion capitals, Paris has the edge now, not just because of fashion, art, etc., but because of these luxury houses and luxury conglomerates. There are some in Italy, but sort of the biggest ones, like the LVMH and the Kering, are established in Paris with these luxury companies like Chanel and Hermes. The Italians are definitely second. The Americans are way behind in terms of getting a handle on making a luxury conglomerate. Because fashion goes up and down, but there's more of a long-term sell-through for luxury. And I think a lot of these companies have really planted their flag on the idea of heritage, luxury, where history continues with us.
Well, I think that we have to thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you all for being here.
I know that Valerie loves, being questioned. So if you have questions, please be free to ask everything that you want to ask to Valerie.
We won't hold you long from your drinks, but if you have a few questions, that would be great.
Yes.
Thank you. Everyone knows that all or most of the great couturiers are gay. It's a point that you mentioned. But I'm sure there is a large canvas of reasons for it. And would you explore, you've worked in the field for so long, would you explore this issue for us?
Well, it's a very complicated issue. I did a show a few years ago, A Queer History of Fashion, from the closet to the catwalk. And I had a great team of gay scholars and activists working with me. And a journalist said to me, I won't print this, but how did you get queer in the title? And I said, my committee wanted that in the title. I said the problem in the title was the word closet. They said that closet was too oversimplified. And I had to say, we're talking about fashion. Can you work with me here? But partly it goes way back. I mean, when I started the research, I thought you'd start with, Dior's generation. Or maybe, like Foucault would say, start with Oscar Wilde, sort of like from then on. It turned out that what we would call gay people were involved in fashion in big cities like London and Paris and Amsterdam as early as the 18th century. And in terms of being fashion trendsetters, in terms of being fashion professionals, working in creation and in sales, and also in terms of sexual subcultures, like sort of cross-dressing subcultures, like at the Molly houses in London. So it's obviously very complicated, and there's no gay gene for fashion. But you do have fashion as being like the theater and film, a milieu in which creativity is valued and a degree of being different is accepted. So that, I think, made it possible for LGBTQ people to find a place in the fashion world where they might have had a harder time finding it in the aeronautics industry, for example. And so that's something that in most periods of time it's completely hidden, and we don't really know whether it went up and down over time, because it was only very, very recently that designers like Gaultier would come out and say, well, yes, of course I'm gay. Even Yves Saint Laurent didn't admit it publicly until he was quite old, even though everybody knew that he lived with Berger, but to actually come out and say it. So when I studied, women in fashion, you can track that, how that goes up and down in history. At some moments, like the 20s and 30s, women are riding high, and at other times they're not. But since you don't know for sure much of the time who's gay, who's lesbian, who's bisexual, who's trans, then you can't really track what might be the cultural links that encourage it or discourage it in particular countries or periods of time. Because I'm sure there's variation from country to country as well, partly depending on how much a country allows men to have an interest in fashion without it being seen as being effeminate. In the United States, fashion was targeted as being a feminine thing quite early on, and a thing that heterosexual men wanted very little to do with. And so that's, in this country, I think it would have been much harder for heterosexual men to get into the fashion industry, and it would have become kind of a mecca for gay men. In other countries where an interest in fashion is perfectly acceptable for men, like Japan, there are gay designers, and there are also heterosexual male designers, because there was never this kind of stigma attached to working in women's fashion. What you do see in the 50s is a kind of open secret where there'll be big newspaper and magazine articles where they'll say, that friend of your wife's named Dior, where the subtext is pretty clearly, even for a mass market American magazine like Life, that gay friend of yours, of your wife's, who's not going to be coming on to her, and so it's safe for him to be undressing her.
Thank you. Another question? Yes.
Are there any new young designers that you both like in the fashion scene now?
Well, young is a relative term in fashion. It's really tricky. It's harder and harder for people to be independent designers now, because they're kind of crushed between the big luxury conglomerates and the big fast fashion conglomerates. Who are some? Oh, yes.
Simone Rocha.
No, Rocha
I mean,
is wonderful. She's
yes,
great.
she's great.
She's very young.
She's very young, and she's based in London, and she's very talented.
Erdem
Yes.
is still quite young.
Yes.
Based in London. A little bit older is
P-
Abe-san behind Statale.
Yes. And Pierre Moss also is interesting.
Peter Moss is really interesting.
And he's based here in Brooklyn.
Right, and he is really quite young.
Yes.
But it happens, like I was going to say Jun Takahashi, but he's sort of already
Yeah.
middle-aged.
Well, I keep thinking that Dolce & Gabbana are the ragazzi, as we used to call them, I ragazzi, the boys. They're 60s.
Yeah.
But for us, they are still the ragazzi. Alessandro Dell'Acqua is another ragazzo, and he's almost 60s as well.
Yeah, well, so are Proenza Schuler, so is
Exactly.
Marc Jacobs. And they're young, but it's all relative. Well, Gaultier is the enfant terrible.
Yeah, and there's almost 70s, but still an enfant.
Stella Jean is pretty young, and she's working
Yes,
out of
Stella
out of
Jean is very
Milan.
good. Yes.
Really interesting.
Yes, he's from Haiti, and she's very good.
She's very talented.
Yeah, she's very good. She's very talented, very colorful.
I just want to thank both of you. As I was trying to sell this evening, I was trying to market it as a sort of a duel between Italy and France. I know that being both of you scholars and in the know,
Well,
we
she's
wouldn't
the
have
scholar,
seen
not me.
a duel. But I found that the conversation extremely interesting and engaging. And what it seems to be, it's much more a history of a constant exchange.
Exactly.
Of coming and going. Of course, the French being more nasty, were less welcoming. Valentino could have never become Valentino had he stayed in Paris. And you underline, Valerie, that for some of the stylists, moving to Paris meant to become who they were, like
Yes,
Balenciaga and
yes.
so on. But for Valentino, he learns the trade in Paris, but he becomes Valentino, and in order to become
yeah,
Valentino,
in Rome.
he has to go back.
Yes.
And it's something which actually even influences professors' clothing. Because in that article where I called professors the worst dressed middle class occupational group in America, I made an exception of Italian professors.
And with this note, I think we have to close. Thank you so much to both of you.